parse it out, and then we look at what each of those forces needs, an Air Force, Navy, this sort of thing, for readiness to deploy. So we break it down into something that's manageable by unit commanders who know what they're expected to do. An Army brigade commander knows he must be able to move, shoot, and communicate with his brigade of troops, close with and destroy an enemy. A ship commander knows he must be prepared to deploy on so many days' notice with this much ordnance and his people trained to do things. So we do have it. It's broken down. It's very complex to make the joint force work, but the commanders know and the troops know, the NCOs know, sir.
Ms. Rosen.
Thank you. I want to thank you for being here into these late hours and your willingness to answer all of our questions so candidly. And, you know, a question was asked a few minutes ago by Rep. O'Rourke that mentioned America's role and inspiration in being a world leader. And Secretary Mattis, in 2013, you said yourself that if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition, ultimately. So we know that the President's budget slashes funding for the State Department and foreign aid about 32%. In a recent op-ed by retired Admiral Michael Mullen and retired General James Jones, they mentioned that research does suggest that investing in prevention is 60 times, I'll say that again, 60 times less costly than war and post-conflict costs. So do you support this decrease of foreign diplomatic support by the President? And doesn't it seem to undermine our success and our stature around the world if we do this?
Congressman, that's a tough one for me to answer because I've not looked at where those cuts lie. You know, I can't give you an authoritative answer. I will tell you that when the President's budget was released, due to the teamwork between Department of Defense and Department of State, we immediately, Secretary Tillerson and I met, and we looked at where is the money that I have for development aid, what does he still anticipate receiving, and looking at how do we jointly figure out the priorities. So we're working on it within a sense of teamwork, a spirit of collaboration between DOD and Department of State to try to get the best return on the money. But I honestly have not looked at his budget and looked at where the cuts are coming from. So I'd rather not speak about something I've not studied.
Thank you. I guess what I want to say about that then is, does that relate? How does that relate to what you're going to request? Because if we don't put money into prevention, is that going to increase your budget requests? And where will that do it, especially in regards to ISIS, cyber, terrorism, some of those issues? If we're not stopping and preventing, then what do you have to do on the back end?
Well, I mean, the challenges we face in some cases, having fought this enemy for a long time, there's probably very little we can do to rationally move them out of where they're at because they didn't rationally gain their perspective. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to take the next generation and prevent them from going down this path. But I would just tell you that in terms of defense of the country, that's what Department of Defense does when it comes to the kinetic side, the lethal side, and making the department the most lethal it can possibly be is where I focus in, although I work very, very closely with Secretary Tillerson to support his efforts.
Thank you. I'll yield back my time.
Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being so patient with us. If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the discussion we had earlier about the size of our Navy fleet. Now, we know from the Navy's force structure assessment that's from just last year that they recommend 355 ships. Our President, our Commander-in-Chief, says he knows we need 350 ships, pretty close to one another, so we know where we want to go. The Congressional Budget Office gave us an estimate that to build a 355-ship Navy would require an additional $5 billion a year for shipbuilding. General Dunford, let me start with you. Do you agree in general with CBO's analysis of what more we need to be spending per year on shipbuilding?
Congressman, I've seen that study, and it looks about right to me based on my experience.
Thank you, sir. Well, looking at this year's budget, obviously after you heard the questioning from Chairman Whitman, we know that we're actually not going in that direction with the proposed budget for 2018. At what point, in your estimation, General, are we going to get to the point where we're spending that extra $5 billion to get to the size of fleet we're trying to get to?
No, Chairman, thanks for asking that question. I mean, my characterization of 18 is that it's the second year in a row we begin to turn around a trend that really was 7 or 8 years in the making, and it's going to take several years to get us out of the hole that we're in right now, which is why I just maybe highlighted in my opening remarks that just to maintain the relative competitive advantage today would require 3% above inflation. And so in the coming years, and of course we don't have a long-term program now, we'll have that in the future, when we think about what's adequate in the future, we need to have it in the context of those requirements that you've identified and the real growth above inflation that will be required to realize that.
Mr. Courtney made a very important point. When you're building ships, the timeline is very long. And so every year that you wait, you push that timeline back further. Do you have any concerns that we're pushing that timeline back further with what's happening with retirement of some of our ships that are presently in the fleet?
Congressman, I do. And the other thing I have a concern about is, back to the example I use of precision munitions, if we told a shipbuilder, with predictability, we were going to build 10 ships, they'd be able to buy 10 ships worth of steel, 10 ships worth of copper piping, copper wiring, and so forth, and it would cost X. The fact that we're not able to provide predictability and actually make multi-year contracts for things like shipbuilding means we pay much more, which means we can't get after meeting the requirements that you've identified. So I am concerned on two fronts. I'm concerned that we're late to need in getting after these requirements, and I'm also concerned that a failure to provide predictability means we won't be able to afford getting to this number of ships with the top line envisioned.
Mr. Secretary, if I could turn to you for a moment. Your boss, the Commander-in-Chief, wants a 350-ship fleet. You just heard what General Dunford said. Where do you see, with the pace that we're on right now, where do you see the fleet being at the end of President Trump's presidency in January of 2025?
Congressman, I think that depends on whether or not sequester is repealed, whether or not we start going for multi-year contract. There's a lot of variables here.
Well, so assume we don't have sequester. Based upon your budget request for 2018 and what I know you're planning for years out from that, where do you see the fleet 8 years from now?
Sir, I need to come back to you with a reply that's researched here. The challenge is, sir, that we're in a position right now where we've got to get the fleet back to sea that we have now. We're trying to address this, try to eat this elephant one bite at a time. And so we're going to have to increase. I would think it's going to take a budget that's probably up around 5% growth, real growth, in order to get towards where we want to go. Not 3% will not do it. 3% growth will not suffice, I'll tell you that. It's going to have to be up over 5%.
Well, General, both to you and to the Secretary, I said this to you when we were together in Singapore a couple of weeks ago. I strongly support what we need to do to give you the resources you need to protect the people of America. And if that means we need to repeal the Budget Control Act, I'm prepared to do that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, I can't tell you how relieved I am that you are in the positions you're in. You actually provide great adult supervision to this administration, and I'm just extremely grateful for your service and for you being where you're at. Secretary Mattis, I would like to follow up on the question that Mr. Lejanvin's question regarding climate change. One of the many reasons why I find President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord disturbing is because of all the security risks we will face if we do not address climate change. For example, rising sea levels will affect the stability of military sites on the coastlines including but not limited to sites in California, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, as they are at higher risk of severe flooding and other extreme weather events. In 2008, the National Intelligence Council found that over 30 military sites in the continental United States are already facing elevated risks because of sea level rise. Secretary Mattis, what actions is the department taking to protect against the effects of sea level rise and climate change in general, especially in terms of protecting critical military infrastructure? And two, how can climate change complicate our strategic objective, especially in terms of our Asia-Pacific rebalance strategy?
Congressman, first I would say that withdrawal from the Paris Accord is not, the administration is not going to do anything about it. They're going to do it under a different framework, but it's not that they're not going to address climate change, a warming climate. As far as what we do to address this inside the military, I've frankly been a little consumed by the situation in Korea and Europe and some others, so I need to get some specifics on this. But I know that we look at that protection of our physical infrastructure wherever we're at, and along the coast, obviously, it's a significant concern with the effects of water, you know, whether it be a hurricane or rising sea levels. But I don't have a good answer for you right now, sir, but I will get you one.
Thank you. Secretary Mattis, it is estimated that it will cost $1 trillion to sustain and modernize the nuclear deterrent over 30 years. We extensively discussed whether such modernization is necessary or not, whether we need more nuclear weapons. However, an area we tend to sideline is the threat of nuclear proliferation. What actions are you taking to address the threat of nuclear proliferation? How vital are non-proliferation programs?
So I think nuclear non-proliferation has not received enough attention over quite a few years. I've met with former secretaries of defense to gain from them their perspective when they were in the job I'm in now. Former Secretary of Defense is coming in to see me tomorrow afternoon after I get done testifying in the morning at the over on the Senate side on this very issue. Rose Gottmuller was mentioned earlier by one of your colleagues. I've met with her in Brussels, but I think this is going to be critical to what we turn over to our children's generation. We have a responsibility to re-energize the nuclear non-proliferation effort.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. I want to talk about North Korea. Kim Jong-un has threatened to build the capability to hit the United States with an ICBM and a nuclear warhead. Seems to be obsessed towards gaining that capability. Secretary Mattis, do you believe that's an existential threat to our country if he were to gain that capability?
I do, Congresswoman. He doesn't have it yet, but we don't have to wait until it's there to start addressing it. Yes, ma'am.
Exactly. And I agree with you, should diplomacy fail, and we need to use conventional capability to deal with this threat, can you paint a picture in this environment of what that would entail and what's left of North Korea when it's over?
It would be a war like nothing we've seen since 1953, and there would not. We would have to deal with it with whatever level of force was necessary. I'm not the most articulate on this, ma'am, but it would be a very, very serious war.
General Dunford, do you want to comment on that?
You asked about North Korea, Congresswoman McSally. Let me talk about South Korea. Regardless of what happens, there's 25 million people in Seoul. 300,000 of those are Americans, are within range of thousands of rockets, missiles, and artillery pieces along the border. I don't have any doubt in my mind if we go to war with North Korea that we will win the war. We will be successful in accomplishing our objectives. I'm equally confident in what Secretary Mattis said, in that conflict we will see casualties unlike anything we've seen in 60 or 70 years. And many of those casualties will be in the first 3, 5, 7 days of the war, where all those people in the Greater Seoul area exposed to the North Korean threat that we will not be able to mitigate initially.
Thank you. I just think the American people need to understand the gravity of the situation that we're dealing with, but also our enemies need to know that ultimately, even as we're discussing readiness challenges and other challenges, we will win. But this is like something we've never seen in my lifetime anyway, should deterrence fail and should diplomacy fail. One of the capabilities you will need in that scenario, I was on the hook to deploy over there in the O plans, is the mighty A-10 Warthog. I was pleased to see in the President's request fully funding the remaining 283 aircraft, which is 9 operational squadrons. But we don't have the funding in there for re-winging the remaining 110 that need re-winging. They'll be grounded soon if they're not re-wung. It is on your unfunded request, which is good. But 9 squadrons is not a lot. Right now they're on the DMZ. They're fighting against ISIS. They're deploying periodically to Europe to deal with the threat from Russia. And last week we had Air Force generals testify that they're willing to go down to 6 squadrons, a cut of 30%. 33%, should the re-winging not happen. So you've agreed that you want this capability at least until 2030, and I appreciate finally getting to that point, and I realize the limitations we've had fiscally in the last years. So we want the capability to at least 2030, but if we were to provide that funding for the re-winging of the remaining 110, would you appreciate having the capacity of having those 9 squadrons given the threats we're facing?
Absolutely, the priorities are right where they are right now, but if we got the money for the additional ones, it would increase our warfighting capability.
Great, thank you. General Dunford, anything else to add?
The only thing I'd say, Congresswoman, I think you understand the dynamic. What I always tell the Chief of Staff of the Air Force is, I said, look, to meet our requirements right now, I need all of your legacy capability and a little bit more. And I also need you to start taking your legacy capability offline to grow the Air Force that we need tomorrow. So they really have come in. I think they've got it about right in terms of prioritization within the top line they've been given. But the truth of the matter is that there is more requirement than there is capability and capacity at 55 squadrons.
Exactly. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. And I yield back.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your service, for your presence here this evening, your stamina, and your patience. I think my question is primarily for Secretary Mattis. You're not only well-read, as I understand, but also well-written. One of your works has already been referred to this evening. I had an opportunity to read an essay that you co-authored entitled "Restoring Our National Security," in which you wrote that for the past 20 years, across administrations of both political parties, the United States has been operating largely unguided by strategy. You say that while we have experienced tactical successes, they don't add up to strategic victories. And in fact, they've cost lives, both soldiers and diplomats, national treasure and global credibility. So I'm a little confused as to why and how you can say that you're confident today about what's being proposed when we are looking at a proposal for a fiscal year 18 budget without what we normally see, which is the future year's defense program. I do acknowledge that in your testimony, your written testimony, I believe you stated as well, that we'll make hard choices as we develop our new defense strategy for fiscal year 19 to 23, and that'll be informed by a national defense strategy. But as we sit here today, wouldn't you say that this is a costly undertaking that you're asking us to take without a strategy? There's been some conflicting comments, sometimes silence on issues like what are the decision rules regarding North Korea's development of nuclear capabilities? What is an acceptable end state regarding China's aggression in the South China Sea? And there are just a lot of other components that would go into a strategy. So what we're seeing here now seems more like a budget designed more for tactical success and not strategic victory. Can you just sort of respond respond to that?
Right. What we have to do is define very clearly what is the threat that we see. And in fact, a number of studies have been mentioned here this evening that have helped in that definition. So far as the point I was making in the article, the chapter you read there on from George Shultz's Blueprint for America, what I was referring to was why did we go into Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and why did we end up with tactical victories and not a strategic outcome? And there's a very interesting article by the President Emeritus, Jim Wright, President Emeritus of Dartmouth University in the Atlantic, July of 2013, said, why do we go into these wars and we don't know how to end them? And the point he made was if you don't define the political end state when you go in, then you cannot figure out how to end the war on a positive note. Notice I left out one war, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, where very clear political guidance was given. But when you shift from those kind of tactical events to more broadly, we can define the threats to this country pretty well right now. That's why I'm confident, Congressman.
Are you confident, though, that we have a strategy for the post-ISIL Syria and Iraq, how we ensure security and stability?
That is being put together. We've been here a couple months. Secretary Tillerson, in his role as Secretary of State, I inform him of the military factors, but this foreign policy of the United States should largely be drawn up by basically the State Department, and I believe he's putting that together very, very well. His diplomats are literally serving alongside us in Syria right now with our officers who are in that fight. So I am confident it's being put together. It's not complete yet, but I know that we've got to fight this enemy no matter what. So that's just part of the current situation we have to address. It does not require a fully fleshed out strategy yet, but we're going to have one pretty darn quick.
Thank you. And finally, if I can get this in, I don't want you to necessarily, you don't have to comment on what you think about the reduction of 29% in the State Department's budget, but is that proposed, because you talked about whole of government approach, the reduction, does that inform the budget that we see in front of us? You know, fewer State Department dollars, you acknowledge that means more Defense Department dollars. Is that reflected in the numbers?
I don't believe so, sir. This is, I mean, I have diplomats from State Department serving alongside us right now, so I have not been affected by a reduction in State Department's budget. And again, I don't feel I'm knowledgeable enough to give you a detailed understanding of what those cuts are. That I'd have to defer to the Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you each for being here tonight. Probably there's no greater historical example of unpreparedness than what happened in the Philippines in 1942. I'd like to read just a couple of brief excerpts from one of those soldiers that was there. There were 10,000 Americans that surrendered. 650 died on the Bataan Death March by itself. All of those that survived that were weakened and endured horrific suffering, and more than 2/3 of them died. One of the survivors stated, "I'm one of the few Americans who has lost a war and who has seen an American army overrun and defeated by a combination of starvation, sickness, unpreparedness, and superior enemy forces. It was a lonesome feeling. I have seen a country we were defending occupied by hostile enemy forces, occupied thoroughly, efficiently, sadistically, and completely. I have seen the American way of life change in one moment and have seen the stunned, bewildered faces of the erstwhile American High Command as they tried to comprehend the enormity of the blow that had just struck them. I've seen veteran officers schooled for 30 years in traditional authority and routine of command change overnight into tired, dirty, beaten, unshaven old men just trying to keep walking. From American soldiers with the heritage of generations of liberty in our blood, we became the chattel. We used to say, if what is happening here could happen to everyone in the United States for just 1 week, what a change it would make in their attitude about the future insurance of our way of life.
Use the prayers of our good people, but remember that prayers work better where the guns are bigger and the planes are faster and the regiments are more numerous. So in the back of all of these plans, I say, let's have what it takes, just in case some gentleman doesn't get the word. I do not know if all the peoples in the different nations will understand our high ideals and unselfish motives, but I do know one thing they'll understand. They'll know what force we have to back up what we say, and if it's big enough, they will act accordingly. The United States is big business. It's bigger than you and bigger than I, and I say there's no cost too great to preserve it. Secretary Mattis, you stated in the remarks tonight that the enemy will move against our weak areas and that Congress has at times risen to the challenge to provide what the military needs. I think we're in one of those moments now. When we take the President's budget and what this committee is proposing, when the DOE and defense-related dollars are subtracted, this committee is proposing about an additional $25 billion baseline dollars over the President's budget of $574. Why could the President not want to take Congress lead, and which budget would best prepare our military?
Congressman, thank you for what you read. I've read about that campaign, and I share your appreciation that either you don't want to be in second place, and we have no right to victory on the battlefield. That takes commitment, and that takes leadership. And how we got into this situation, I mean, I told you I was shocked when I came back and saw this. We are going to have to move this forward in a stable way. I'll just give you an example. We could not recruit right now 100,000 more troops for the U.S. military, additional, right now. You heard the acknowledgement earlier about what % of our young people are even eligible. We could not right now have the industrial base to build the number of ships, even if you were to somehow repeal the BCA, repeal the Budget Control Act, say you're going to pass budgets on time. We literally could not do some of this that would fully address what you rightly bring up in your role to raise armies and sustain navies. I would just tell you that we're going to have to work together, and if this is the will of the Congress, that they'd be willing to spend that amount, I am confident that the Commander-in-Chief would be in your corner all the way.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. O'Halloran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service to our country and for those that you lead. Thank you for their service and their families. I want to bring us back to a couple of things, but one of them is the cost issue. It's obvious that we need to invest. And it's also obvious to me that we need to eliminate the Budget Act issues and all the other issues associated with it. But we still have a situation here where, as much as you want to know where we are going to go for you, we need to know where you want to go in the future. And then we've heard the issue of studies so far. We've talked about $19 billion plus a year for inflation at 3%. We've now talked about $5 billion potentially for additional ships, puts us up to $24+ billion, not compounded over the years, but just at today's rates. And this is just a statement, but I really have a concern with being able to get to next year and where we're going to be with the larger scope of budget needs that the Congress has before it. The second thing is Secretary, you mentioned that that for the enlisted people, they were competitive with salary with the high school diplomas, and we probably are. But we're not asking, and I'm not saying something you don't know, but I just want to make clear that we're not asking these young men and women to go and do work here in the United States at one location and not move their families around and not put themselves in harm's way. This is something that we need to be better than the competitive atmosphere in our society today. And I want to go back to the Secretary of State's issue. The cut is 32% to the State Department. That includes the U.S. Agency for International Development, and a cut of nearly half to development assistance. These are programs that obviously, talking does one thing. You have to be able to negotiate with a package and stop terrorism by getting to the hearts of people. These are what a lot of these programs are for. And Secretary, you had made a statement that reducing regional chaos in tandem with our interagency partners and international allies to help foster a coherent order requires adequate diplomatic resources. And former Chairman Admiral Mullen has stated that cutting the budget in this manner puts the lives of our men and women in uniform at risk. So instead of getting into the cost issue, can we have agreement that it is critical that our State Department be able to function at the highest level necessary to work in unison with you, the Defense Department, and other agencies, so that we can stop wars and therefore stop the bloodshed that we're trying to prevent through both the kinetic energy and the State Department side of the equation?
Yes, sir, and I want to always make certain our diplomats under Secretary Tillerson are negotiating from a position of strength that the U.S. military, well-funded U.S. military, can provide.
Thank you, Secretary, and I just want to say thank you for the great work that you're doing right now, and bringing Mr. Norquist on. I think you have a job that you're going to have a challenge at. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Desjardins.
The Russians and Chinese are allocating more and more resources towards advanced weaponry and technology and are making rapid gains in these areas, especially hypersonics. As you may be aware, several news outlets have reported that Russia recently conducted tests of its Zircon hypersonic missile nearly a year ahead of schedule. Defense analysts have described this as a quantum leap in technology. When it comes to hypersonics, do you feel like we're where we need to be to meet these threats?
No, sir. This is the fourth concurrent force I mentioned about rapid technological change. I think we have got to increase our hypersonic R&D effort.
Do you feel the bureaucracy and compartmentalization of our budget process is putting us in a vulnerable position in areas such as R&D?
There are areas, sir, where we need to get acquisition reform, and we need it quickly. I'm bringing in people from private industry with those specific skill sets in order to identify to you the problems well enough that you can see the solution here, because some of it requires legislative relief. Much of it requires reform inside the department.
Is part of your reevaluation of the missile defense budget going to be allocated towards hypersonic defense systems? I think right now $75 million has been set aside.
I'm not sure where the money will be taken from or if it will be added on, but I know we're going to have to put more money into hypersonic R&D.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Swazi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, whenever I'm in this hearing room, I'm always sobered by the important responsibility that we as elected officials have, and I'm incredibly sobered by the awesome responsibility that each of you have, and I thank you again for your wonderful service. Secretary Mattis, you talked about this close collaboration you have with Secretary Tillerson, trying to work together to have a joint strategy. I was fortunate to go to Afghanistan in April and was very impressed by the four-year plan that there was, the by, with, and through strategy of building up the Afghan Army and Air Force and the Special Forces and putting pressure on trying to get a little bit more out of Pakistan to do their responsibilities. But I didn't see a similar four-year plan with the State Department. Are you developing plans together that are long-term plans in conjunction with each other as a whole of government?
Secretary Tillerson and I are tied at the hip on this, sir. I assure you the planning is ongoing to keep us in step with one another and to ensure that we have a tandem approach to this, not just a military or even a principally military. It's got to be a collaboration.
It'd be great if there were documents that showed this collaboration between these two branches, this whole of government, that showed a long-term plan as to how to address, or a short-term plan even, how to address our situation in Afghanistan. In this current budget, the request for funds is for the current 8,448 troops. And when we went to Afghanistan, General Nicholson and others made a very persuasive case that a few thousand, 3,000, 5,000 more troops for force protection and to replace some of these private contractors really made a lot of sense. It will save money, it will build morale, it will be effective in helping out. In May, a report came out in a Bloomberg article that the intelligence community is pushing for 50,000 more troops, and it looked like it was a move away from by, with, and through. So can you put us at ease as to what the current thinking is regarding, the current force level versus an increase, a modest increase for force protection versus this report of 50,000 more troops?
Sir, I give no credibility to any report about 50,000 more troops. I can assure you neither the commander in the field nor the chairman of the Joint Chiefs have given me any request like that. Not even close. That's somebody's flight of fantasy, I assure you, sir.
Thank you. And the by, with, and through strategy is the strategy that we're going to continue in the foreseeable future.
And how we enable them by, with, and through, but also perhaps a little more regional approach, sir.
General Scarpati was here on March of 28th of 2017, and he said that additional Russian activity short of war range from disinformation to manipulation. Examples include Russia's outright denial of involvement in the lead-up to Russia's occupation and attempted annexation in Crimea, attempts to influence elections in the United States, France, and elsewhere, its aggressive propaganda campaigns targeting ethnic Russian populations among its neighbors, and cyber activities directed against infrastructure in the Baltic nations and the Ukraine. In all of these ways and more, Russia is attempting to exert its influence, expand its power, and discredit the capability and relevance of the West. And, we hear this all the time, and a lot of it's caught up in the partisanship these days. But Russia is a bad actor, especially in Europe and Eastern Europe. Forget about the United States now and everybody's in the news these days. What is the DoD's responsibility regarding hybrid warfare to combat, we talk heavily about troops and about equipment. What are we doing to combat this hybrid warfare of propaganda, disinformation from the DoD's perspective? And what can we do, and how else can we assist you?
I'll have the chairman speak to this for a moment, sir. What you defined with General Scaparotti's words there, Russia has chosen to be a strategic competitor. They want a veto authority over the diplomatic, economic, and security interests of their near abroad, and actually a little deeper than just near abroad. The changing character of war, this deniable gray zone, cyber, this is what you're seeing.
And beyond that, corruption, outright corruption. They're trying to make money by undermining governments in Eastern Europe and Europe.
Absolutely. So how do we adapt to this so that we're not waiting with tank columns for an enemy that never can be taken on? It's the changing character of war. Let me have the chairman just give a few groups on this. It's a heavily military education issue as well of our own.
Congressman, we've spent a lot of time over the past year looking at this issue, and if you really break it down into political influence, economic coercion, information operations, cyber capabilities, military posture, all put together to advance Russia's national interests. I think the U.S. military presence in Europe is a key piece of it, our assurance. Our cyber capabilities are an important part of it. Information operations is something we can do from a military perspective. The one thing that Russia is able to do is very quickly integrate their entire government to advance their interests in Europe. And one of the things that they're doing, of course, is undermining the credibility of our alliance structure in NATO and causing people to question whether we can meet our alliance commitments. And so I think at least 3 out of the 5 major areas are areas where there is a military dimension. But the thing I'd emphasize is that what you're describing, I call it adversarial competition. It has a military dimension. It falls short of war, but it also is the whole of government. And I think probably 3 out of the 5 areas I mentioned are areas where the military can contribute, but the entire government needs to be waging in this adversarial competition.
Well, I've used up all my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to discussing this further in the future. Thank you.
Dr. Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your endurance tonight, gentlemen. I've heard some phraseology used tonight, prioritize, challenges with families, don't have the reach, balancing act, and it all goes back to the Budget Control Act. just we're not giving you guys the money that you have to do. And I know, Secretary Mattis, your burden must be very great trying to balance this on a daily basis. So certainly us on the committee, but all of Congress, we've got to put our money literally where our mouth is and break this Budget Control Act. And I know we on the committee with the chairman's leadership certainly would love to do that. One of your priorities with your 2018 in your testimony was to keep the faith with the servicemen and women and their families. I saw where in Italy, for example, you've got 2 naval hospitals and 1 Air Force hospital that are on a closure list. And I worry that when and if those do get shut down, that standard of care for the service members and their families will suffer greatly. And I guess my question, Secretary Mattis, is what's your opinion on that? What's your take on the closure of those 3 hospitals and hospitals like those? Where will these people go? I'm worried about the standard of care being lowered. I'll let you answer.
I've got to look at it, sir. I'd have to look at the specifics of the location, but the bottom line is we can't deploy troops and families where we don't provide sufficient hospital care. So let me look at those 3 in Italy and come back to you with what we have in mind and what we're going to do to mitigate any loss of capability. But I can't give you a good answer right now, sir.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, get back to me as soon as you can. It's been referenced with the maintenance issue on the aircraft. We, in this particular hearing room, we've also been told by others where we are 1,500 to 1,600 pilots short. We're about 3,400 to 3,500 maintainers short. You've got the commercial airlines that are pulling pilots from the military daily, and even with the commercial carriers incentivizing with perks and monies, they are still not able to meet their demands, and they are even talking about reducing routes commercially. What is the DoD doing to retain, build a pilot cadre, and is it even solvable with money? Where would it go?
Congressman, you've just identified an issue that actually is keeping the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Chief of Naval Operations and the Commandant of the Marine Corps awake at night. And there actually is collaboration right now with industry to look at this as a national problem for the aggregate number of pilots, both for the commercial sector as well as for the Department of Defense. And so General Goldfein has been leading an effort to do that, to open up that dialogue and look at what will it take to rebuild that pilot base to meet both commercial needs and military needs. And of course, in the near term, one thing we use is the incentive system to keep our pilots in. A key piece of the incentive system, though, is not just base pay and bonuses for flying. We call it quality of work. It's the number of hours you fly and your confidence in your aircraft and those kinds of things. So those are the areas that the Chief of Staff of the Air Force is focused on the squadron level. That's where it makes a difference. And in a number of initiatives that he's doing, they're designed specifically to retain pilots. But as you point out, it's going to take a public-private dialogue and solution to get at both the commercial requirements and the department's requirements.
Well, like you gentlemen, I have the highest faith in the Chief of the Air Force also, Dr. Goldfein. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, I am a new congressman, and I have to tell you that I was surprised by the amount of engagements we have across the globe. I quickly became a disciple of a 355-ship Navy. You have spoken in your testimony today, or at least alluded to, that our future defense strategy might change or evolve. I don't want to put words into your mouth, sir. My initial question is this. I understand our national defense strategy to be being capable of fighting 2 major conflicts simultaneously, perhaps one with a state actor, perhaps one with a non-state actor. Do you envision, as I know your crystal ball may not be perfect, but do you envision that aspect of our national defense strategy changing over time?
Sir, if the enemy, our adversary, has 4 courses of action that I prepare for, I'm pretty confident number 5 will be the one he uses. What I'm saying is we have a fundamentally unpredictable phenomenon that this committee deals with, and that's called war. That is the auditor that we have to be prepared for. Ultimately, it audits our recruiting, our equipping, our research, our pay. It audits everything about the military. So how do we create a military that's got a shock absorber in it so that when surprise strikes, we are ready for it? I believe that we will have to be ready for more than one adversary at one time because we're up against thinking, cunning adversaries, and if they see us engaged with one in one arena and they have mischief in mind, they certainly will take advantage of our distraction. So in creating a military with a shock absorber in it, we have to be prepared to do more than one thing at a time.
I would also ask you, I know that maybe it was Mr. Whitman, maybe it was Mr. Courtney, but someone asked you about the $1 billion reduction in the shipbuilding account, and I have to confess to you that I either missed your answer or didn't understand your answer. Would you mind repeating your answer as to why that's justified at this time?
I would not justify reducing the shipbuilding account. Right now, we are trying to prioritize readiness. In other words, we have ships that you have already bought, that we already have manned, that cannot go to sea. So in some cases, what we are doing is putting money into readiness while trying to save the shipbuilding account so we have tomorrow's readiness being constructed today. But this is a matter of prioritization, Congressman, as we deal with the reality of too many years of these ships not being maintained in a way that we get full use out of them. So, you know, what we can't do is cease to put in operations and maintenance money there because we're putting it all into building new ships. As much as I'd love to build new ships with it, it's a balancing act, sir.
So, Mr. Secretary, would you reject the characterization then that the funding for the Navy shipbuilding and conversion account relative to FY17 has been reduced?
No, sir. I just ask for your patience that we're digging our way out of a readiness hole. And in order to do that, we can't always build or put the money where we would want to if we didn't have to deal with this reality that comes from years of living under the Budget Control Act where we have been unable to maintain the ships. It is not the option that I would prefer.
Again, I apologize if this question has already been asked, but at what point in the future do you see us making strides towards that 355-ship Navy, positive strides, whether it's getting out of whatever holes you perceive us being in or just what?
I think even this year, with 9 ships in the budget, sir, at least it starts us in the right direction. But it's only a start, and I share your impatience or your concern about it. And in 2019 to 2023, obviously we need the kind of growth that the Chairman Dunford was referring to, of 3 to 5% a year, in order to start enlarging the fleet. We need a larger fleet. I don't seem to get much argument on that from anybody, so I think it's a matter of allocating the resources.
Sadly, my time is used up, but I thank you, sir.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all you gentlemen for being here. I still currently serve in the Mississippi Army National Guard. I've served there for almost 32 years, be 33, I think, in December. Our readiness levels is not where I've seen it in my entire career. And I think there are units that are really good. I think there's equipment. But we have got to maintain our equipment and get back to the level that we can sustain. And I don't think that we can do that on the budget that's proposed of $603 billion. I think we need to be more in the range of 604. We talked about munitions. Those can come out of OCO because they're being used in operations or overseas contingency operations. So I don't understand why we can't have a little certainty in purchasing new munitions through the OCO funding that is specifically to buy those munitions that we're shooting at the bad guys. Equipment. We have got to, right now what I'm seeing, and it's all underhanded, and nobody said this. This is just Trent Kelly's little assumption. But right now, what I'm seeing is most of the active component services are eyeballing the equipment of the Guard and Reserves and saying we can transfer this to us and give them the old stuff and fall in on their stuff to help us get through. I don't blame them for doing that, but that doesn't help us long-term readiness. We've got to be equipped. If you want me to go fight the enemy as a National Guardsman, I've got to have a M1A2 SEP V2 tank. I cannot deploy in the M60A3 and achieve the effects that I need to achieve. Our communications don't work. We ought to look and smell the same, whether it's active or reserve, and get the force structure to meet that. But when we start trying to take equipment from one to shift to the other, in the old Army that I grew up in, you didn't hot rack tanks. You didn't use other people's equipment. You painted your name on yours, and you owned it, and you took a lot of pride in it. Our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines, they don't have to do that anymore because they don't deploy with their equipment. They deploy with somebody else's. And they leave it over there for the next guy to fall in on, and the guys back here can't train because of readiness. What are we doing to get the spare parts and to get the current fleet across the board, not to transfer readiness from one unit to the other, but to actually start building the OR rates of these units?
Well, sort of the first step at that was the $21 billion that the Congress gave us for the FY17 supplemental was directly targeted on this. This budget this year is designed to further that, but sir, it took us a long time to get here, and I share your impatience with this, but I would tell you too that OCO will not tell industry with any confidence that they should open another line, put in the money into their industrial plant, because they don't know if that's going to be there next year. This has got to be part of a budget plan if we want them to make the industrial contribution that their stockholders are going to have to put money up for, because for them to go broke is not part of their responsibility. So OCO does not help us expand the industrial base. We can get max out of the industrial base, but they're not going to build more industrial base on OCO.
So then why don't we ask for 640 instead of 603 and call it all top-line spending and not OCO?
Well, I mean, that's an option, sir. As you know, we're already coming in asking you to bust the Budget Control Act. I mean, at some point we have to recognize the law that you've passed. And I don't have an answer because that law was passed with the idea that it would be so injurious that it would never go into effect. Well, it's been in effect for years now, and frankly, the Department of Defense cannot change that law. Only Congress can.
I agree wholeheartedly, Secretary, and we've got to break the sequester and the BCA. I do think that we need a higher number, and I think we need the certainty to go with that. If we give that to you, can you spend that on training soldiers? We don't have enough slots to train soldiers. We can't send soldiers to additional training to developing classes, AIT and NCOES and OES. Can you spend that money in new schools and new things to train these soldiers and equipment if we get that BCA busted and we give you the money on the top line?
We can, sir. It would help if it was in multi-year money so that we could have a program that we know we're going to implement over a couple of years. It would help if it came in a budget on time, not a continuing resolution. With the paralysis, a continuing resolution will apply to us. So with fiscal discipline, we will do our level best to spend every bit of it and address every problem you've got. We share your assessment of what the problem is.
Thank you all for your service, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service to our country and for being so patient to take questions from some of the junior members. Secretary Mattis, Gio Saba and my staff tells me how respected you were back home at Stanford. Appreciate your service. I have two questions. I want to read from the 809 panel interim report, which, as you're aware, was the commission panel created to help streamline the defense acquisition process. And they wrote, according to DOD, the last major defense downturn in the late 1980s and early 1990s resulted in more than 300 prime contractors, platform providers, and sub-tier companies merging to form 5 mega primes of today: Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. My question is, do you think there is enough competition in the defense industrial base, and what steps are you taking to create more competition?
It's very hard for us to create competition, sir. It's based on how much budget we have and how many different companies feel they can compete and stay healthy. We saw this coming in the 1990s. What the Defense Department did, I happen to be the Executive Secretary to 2 Secretaries of Defense, William Perry and William Cohen. They looked at each case where they concentrated the industrial base into smaller and fewer companies, larger actually, but fewer companies. But there was no way to maintain the vitality, the financial vitality of the companies, and if we stood in the way of it. So it was forced on us. We were worried about it then. We saw this coming where there'd be less competition, but frankly, we were unable to sustain an effort to maintain the wider industrial base.
Well, I hope you'll consider things we can do to have more competition if it's possible. My second question concerns, your testimony was very eloquent, where you said our nation has been at war for 16 years, the longest war our country has faced, and that this has been in part why our resources have been strained. And I think if you were to look objectively at Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and ask, has our country met the objectives we set out to meet, you would probably get people on both sides of the aisle saying that hasn't been the case. I mean, as you know, much better than I, Taliban still controls 40% of Afghanistan. And so where I come in Silicon Valley, when you have a business and they come for more funding, one of the questions will be, well, is the strategic plan working, or do we need a change in strategy? And my question is, I have great confidence in our troops. I have less confidence in the policymakers. Do we need, before we talk about more funding, a clear sense of what the strategy is going to be, so that we know that the last 16 years, if we haven't achieved our goals, that we will achieve our goals in these regions?
Well, I think we do need a change in strategy, and I think it's got to be one that starts with a good exchange between the Congress and the level of resources they believe is appropriate to the Department of Defense. And I would start there by saying that continued BCA, which makes the Congress a spectator to all this, is probably an irresponsible way to go. I'm much more comfortable coming up here and defending a strategy and a good relationship and a good discussion back and forth than I am with coming up here as we all watch BCA put us into a position that some of the serving members who have been in the National Guard and the Armed Forces say is destroying that very military readiness. So it's a balancing act of getting a good strategic dialogue, determining what level of the government's treasure we're willing to put into defense, and make certain that what we've got are well-defined objectives that we can accomplish. I'm not going to condemn what someone has done before me. I'll leave that to history. I'm here to deal with the reality of the threats to the country today.
Thank you for your answers. I yield back the balance of my time.
Sure.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, 2 years ago, Lieutenant General Gluck told this committee that the COCOM demand for amphibs was closer to 54 than the nominal Navy Marine Corps unconstrained goal of 38. Is that still the case?
That's pretty close to being the case, Congressman. I remember those numbers. I was the commandant in the Marine Corps at the time.
And if anything, I would submit that the Navy's 2016 force structure assessment, where the formal requirement was raised from 34 to 38, suggests that in a greater threat environment, the amphibious demands are growing. Despite this trend, your budget request does not support another amphibious ship until FY 2020. Navy officials have supported the long-term layup of certain amphibious ships, which, while it will support certain modernization and readiness requirements, will also take them out of the fleet and further reduce our amphib capacity. Your FY 18 request also reduces the planned procurement of ship-to-shore connectors from 6 in the FY 17 FYDP to 3. So I guess my question at the end of the day is, in light of that, does the FY 18 budget request improve or degrade the capacity of the Navy Marine Corps team to project power?
Congressman, I have to go back and check the numbers, but it certainly doesn't enhance the capability of the Navy Marine Corps team to project power.
I think that the answer we've heard sort of in the 5 or so ship building or Navy questions we've asked tonight is that you've chosen to prioritize readiness over long-term shipbuilding. And I understand why readiness is so important. I just don't understand why we can't do both at the same time. When you look at Reagan's first full-year budget, he added $3 billion on Navy O&M, $10 billion on shipbuilding. So why have we chosen this sort of false choice, that's my word, right now between readiness and long-term shipbuilding in this budget?
Well, it's a good question, Congressman, and I don't take any issue with where you're going with it. I would just tell you that when we're already busting the BCA cap by $52 billion, this is not a budget that's taking readiness or modernization laying down, but we have got to marry our time. Congress has the Budget Control Act in effect. I mean, if we walk into here acting as if there's nothing that you've said and put into law has any effect, you would understandably, or at least some members of the Congress would understandably question our judgment. Mm-hmm. We've got to at least deal with this. And if you come out and tell us that you're willing to go right now as a Congress, not this committee has stood by us through thick and thin. This committee is not the problem, nor are your colleagues on the Senate Armed Service Committee. You know where the problem lies. It's more broadly, and please guide us, talk to us. We're eager to do what you're talking about.
I guess my only difference of opinion on that approach is it suggests that the Pentagon and the President are passive spectators in this process and have priced in sort of what the congressional market can bear, when we know that sort of leadership from Article 1 can change the market dynamics themselves.
Well, Article 1, if I remember right, sir.
Article 2, excuse me.
Yes, sir. I think Article 1 is
if you are indeed urging us to, you've both condemned BCA, why does the budget extend the reductions under BCA from 2021 when they expire through 2027? Are those just placeholders? It grinds it down to roughly 2% of GDP.
Go ahead.
When you're looking at the FIDUP, the out years numbers, those are placeholders.
Okay.
As the Secretary Mattis has referenced, when the studies are done, next year we'll include the out years and the implications, but right now they're just placeholders.
Sure. And then quickly, going back to a line of questioning that Mr. Conaway and Ms. Hanabusa brought up, you said that you made the claim in your testimony that a round of BRAC could allow us to buy something like 120 Super Hornets. What is the department's assessment of what we've been able to buy from the last round of BRAC?
We could go in and show the amount of money that we've saved, and we just, obviously it goes into the defense budget. We can give you some examples of what I was showing, examples of what that savings would translate to in terms of combat capability. But we can certainly go back, show you what we've saved from past BRACs, and then tell you what that translates into in terms of number of ships or airplanes or tanks or whatever.
And then I think we all appreciate that, and also an assessment of what investments in readiness we're prepared to forego in order to fund another round of BRAC. In other words, sort of reverse the dynamic and say, how many Hornets would it cost us to fund BRAC? But I think we would really appreciate that assessment.
You mean for a couple of years until it started paying off?
All the costs are on the front end.
Okay.
Thank you. I yield.
Mr. Secretary, the last round of BRAC took more than 10 years to break even. So just part of the reason there's concern on this committee is, and last time I checked with CBO, they didn't have it breaking even yet. Now that's been a year or so. But there's no doubt it took more than 10 years to break even, not a couple. And so that has left a bitter taste in a lot of folks' mouth that did not achieve the savings that were promised. So just an editorial comment. I'm happy to continue to talk, as I know other members are, but the last one is not a very good basis to go on.
Well, I would try to align. I told you I don't accept the current assessment.
I appreciate that.
And what we'll do is we'll look at what can we do to make certain that what we get rid of this next time starts paying off in 5 years, not 10 or 20.
It's got to be a different approach.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your patience in being here and for your leadership. A lot of great, insightful comments tonight, and I thank you for them. One of the ones that stand out is just the fact that we have this huge bow wave of modernization, as the chairman pointed out, and you've had to work within the top line that you've been given, and that the BCA has had that huge impact. So I think it's just a great summary of what you've had to contend with here. My first question is for the chairman dealing with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Today, only 30% of our combat commanders, airborne intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or ISR, are being met by our capabilities from the combatant commanders, their requirements. This means we are choosing between providing ISR support for counterterrorism or collection of peer competitors like Russia or China. Is 30% good enough? And does the current budget proposal by you or by the executive branch here, is it helping to narrow that gap?
Congressman, just a little bit of history. We've actually grown the ISR enterprise by 1,200% since 2001. We've increased the numbers of platforms by 600% since 2008, and we're currently meeting 30% of the requirements. So this is one of those areas in the department I actually don't think we can buy our way out of. And it's probably number one, not probably, it is number one for me in terms of innovation initiatives, leveraging big data, and finding a different way to feed decision making. In other words, we won't be able to buy enough platforms to meet the current articulated requirement by the combatant commanders, and yet we still need to get the intelligence necessary to feed decision making. So I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that we're growing now from 60 caps to 90 caps over the next couple of years. That's our program growth, so that's a 50% growth. And at the end of that period of time, I suspect we'll be somewhere at 34% or 35%. So the areas that we need to burn some intellectual capital on, this particular problem is at the top of the list.
Okay. Secretary Mattis, do you have anything else to add to that?
Sir, as our military has shrunk in size, the need for more precise intelligence is one of the ways we mitigate the risk of that smaller military. So part of this is a growing need for a level of what's over the next hill, where's the enemy, what's going on, as we've gotten a smaller military that we are still committing, as you know, around the world. We didn't pull everybody out as we'd anticipated a few years ago and reconstitute it at a time when we could have put more effort into this, more finances into it. So we're going to have to continue to work this, but what we're doing right now is challenging for us, very challenging to shrink this gap.
Okay. Another area of concern is electronic warfare. When I came in 1985, we had let's say a dominant electronic warfare capability compared to our near peers, we'll say. But in the 90s and I think the 2000s, we let it atrophy. And I would say today the Russians and Chinese are producing electronic warfare capabilities, technology-wise and capacity-wise, that exceeds us. Does this budget, Chairman, does it help narrow that gap in the electronic warfare realm?
Congressman, it does, and we started in 17, and I couldn't agree with you more that our competitive advantage has eroded over time in electronic warfare. And when we talk about our ability to project power, and we talk about adversaries like China and Russia specifically targeting our ability to move into an operational area and then operate freely within that area. You've heard the term anti-access area denial. Electronic warfare is one of the key areas that we need to improve our competitive edge.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, anything else to add? Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to each of you, sirs, for joining us late into the evening tonight to talk about these important issues. Mr. Secretary, General Nicholson suggested and you endorsed efforts to add a, quote, few thousand additional troops to prop up the Afghan security forces in the face of aggressive Taliban attacks. I want to dig more deeply into testimony that you've already provided related to the budget related to Afghanistan. Why would a new total of approximately 15,000 troops be decisive when just a few years ago there were close to 100,000 troops in Afghanistan? Have our interest or the mission changed?
The Afghan army, as you know, has been fighting hard, and you just have to look at the casualty figures to see that reality. The troops that are being asked for by General Nicholson, and I don't want to characterize them all this way, but many of them are going to be what we call train, advise, assist. These are troops that are specifically trained by our U.S. Army to go out in the field, and you apply them with the brigades, the Afghan brigade. Now remember, we've been operating at what we would call the 3-star headquarters, the corps level headquarters. Below them is the 2-star division headquarters, then you get down to the 1-star and colonels in the brigades. We're talking now about putting people who can call NATO air support down at the brigade level. So when they are in contact, the high ground is now going to be owned by the Afghans. It's a fundamental change to how we bring our what I would call our real superiority in terms of air support to help them. So in other words, we're not talking about putting our troops in the front line and saying somehow a few thousand more troops in the front line alongside them are going to help taking the hill by closing with their rifles and machine guns. These are going to be people specifically designed, trained, and organized and equipped to go in and advise them how to take the hill, get them the air support, the artillery support, the rocket support that will enable them. Does that help to address your question?
Yes, Mr. Secretary, like you, I'm supportive of ensuring that al-Qaeda and groups that want to attack the U.S. homeland are unable to gain safe haven again in Afghanistan, and I support those efforts. But when it comes to corruption and ensuring to the American taxpayers that the investment is a sound one in Afghanistan, what do we need to do to ensure that our support for the Afghan security forces is used appropriately and effectively?
Yeah, I think corruption has been probably the biggest strategic vulnerability that we faced in terms of the government of Afghanistan gaining the respect and the trust of their own people. The authorities we give and the expectations we give to these troops that we're plugging in down at lower levels, for one thing, will help to change that. But furthermore, I went to Afghanistan here a month and a half ago, and I met the officer who's now been put in charge of going after corruption. I find a fellow who's serious, but as you know, this is a society that's run by reciprocity. It's a tribal society by and large, and we're going to have to deal with the corruption in a way consistent with that society. They recognize the problem there. They recognize that something's got to be done about it. But this is a critical problem. I'd say this biggest strategic problem we face is corruption, and we will be dealing with it. President Ghani has got a problem to deal with it, or has a program to deal with it, and we'll do our best to address it. We've got to.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Secretary Mattis and General Dunford. I appreciate your time here this evening. First of all, I want to say I completely agree we've got to repeal the Budget Control Act. I believe there's no more important obligation we have as members of Congress than providing resources necessary for the defense of the nation. It doesn't matter how much health care reform we do, how much tax reform we do. It doesn't matter if we balance our budget. If we get this wrong, none of that matters. And we can't get this right without repealing the Budget Control Act. Having said that, though, I'm very troubled by the budget that the administration has put forward. And I think that in both of your written testimony to the committee and a testimony here tonight, you've done a tremendous job at laying out the gravity of the threats that we face, laying out the seriousness of the situation, the pace of advancements that our adversaries are making against us, including in areas we may not be able to counter or defend against. And dominance lost. And in particular, General Dunford, in your written testimony, you talk about within 5 years the potential that we would lose the ability to project power. Yet the budget that's been presented to us is at best a holding pattern, at best. When we face an existential threat from North Korea and this budget cuts missile defense, it cuts directed energy funding, which in your testimony, Secretary Mattis, you said is crucial. I want to understand, General Dunford, this is a question for you, how can we possibly justify, we've heard tonight this budget is a holding pattern before we get to real growth. how can we possibly justify a year of holding pattern? Why isn't it better to begin the real growth today when we should have begun it yesterday?
Congresswoman, all I can do is tell you if our priorities are correct within the top line that I've been given. And when I talked about that 5 years, and we'll talk more in detail on Wednesday night, we came up with that by analyzing our peer competitors by functional area and taking a look at where are we today, where will we be in 5 years based on projected resources, where are our potential adversaries today, and where will they be in 5 years. So I'm trying to share with you the problem. I can't solve it. I can tell you that we have the right priorities within the top line we've been given, but I've also emphasized that if we don't turn around the trend, if we don't change the trajectory that we're on, that's where we will be at a competitive disadvantage within 5 years. So I'm trying to do the best I can with candor to share the situation as it exists today and what it will be in 5 years if we don't actually take action.
I appreciate that. Who gave you the top line? Are we talking about OMB?
That's correct. It's a growth of about 5%, a little over 5% over 2017. And it's, as I said, it's $52 billion above the BCA cap. At some point, we have got to get some freedom, and OMB will need the same freedom.
Right, but with all due respect, Mr. Secretary, if we are in a hole that may be greater than we've certainly been in since the 1970s. We are facing an array of threats. You said in your testimony that is basically more volatile than at any time in your career. And so I'm trying to understand how it is that we could possibly have an administration that's saying, but it's okay, we can wait until next year to begin the serious buildup. I don't think anyone is saying that, ma'am. At 5% growth, that's a bit of a change, to say the least. Well, it's 3%, as I understand it, Mr. Secretary, over 2017? Over the Obama administration request for 2017. Okay. Well, Congresswoman, we're growing the budget. We're dealing with readiness problems that we inherited, that the Congress has watched for some time, and we are going to do our best to create combat capability as swiftly as we can using an all-volunteer force and trying to get ships back to sea, trying to get airplanes back in the air. But I'm sorry, Mr. Secretary, but I just don't understand when you say we're doing it as quickly as we can, why, tonight we've said we're going to begin real growth next year. Right. Why are we all right to wait until next year to begin that real growth? Well, for one thing, ma'am, we've got to put some money, a lot of money, into readiness where we're already in a hole. I've looked at the unfunded priorities list, and after the priorities we've already set, I agree with every one of the unfunded priorities as well. And that's $33 billion more dollars. But the bottom line is you're asking us to come in with a budget request beyond what we have now. That would be even more of a violation of the act that Congress has passed. I mean, we need some direction from you as well. I mean, frankly, as I recall my civics textbook, the president doesn't even have to send a budget. I mean, right, but that's Mr. up to Secretary, you. Well, with all due respect, I know my time is up. Just to echo what my colleague, Mr. Gallagher, said, the president's got to lead on this. And in terms of the budget proposal that came up, and I know you dealt with this issue of the proposed caps, but the president's budget extends the Budget Control Act out 6 years. So we can say it's a placeholder, but Table S7 foresees the Budget Control Act and the caps going beyond where they're supposed to be today. And so I think we can all agree we've got to repeal the Budget Control Act. It's crucially important. But we can't be in a holding pattern, in my opinion, with all due respect, for a year, while we face the grave nature of the threats we face. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and General Dunford, Secretary Mattis, Mr. Norquist. I'm grateful tonight to see the bipartisan appreciation of your service. It's clear that we all want you to be successful for American families. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Daniel Allen, testified that, quote, based on current readiness levels, the Army can only accomplish defense planning guidance requirements at a high military risk, end of quote. General Dunford, what is your assessment of the impact on our soldiers of being able to accomplish requirements at a high military risk? How many casualties does this mean for the Army to incur when it's ordered to fight at a high military risk? How many casualties at a low military risk?
Congressman, without talking about a specific scenario, I can't talk about casualties, but when General Allen did testify and when we all testified to risk, we do look at two variables. One is the time it takes to accomplish the objectives, and then the amount of casualties that we would estimate under particular circumstances. So I think what General Allen was suggesting is that readiness translates into casualties, and I would subscribe to that as well.
And I appreciate that Colonel Paul Cook has reflected such concern and wants to work with you, obviously. And, Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for your very clear warnings about the destructive consequences of sequestration. But at the same time, the budget level in your request, how many years do you think it will take the Army to address high military risk?
Well, it's a constantly moving target, sir, because the enemy doesn't stand still. But I would just tell you that between 2019 and 2023, we intend to significantly grow the force, the Navy fleet, the Army brigades, and the fighter squadrons to reduce that risk.
And Mr. Secretary, I'm very concerned, as Ms. Cheney too. The defense budget request states, quote, the condition of mission facilities, airfields, training areas, housing, barracks, directly impacts the readiness of the units and the morale of the soldiers, civilians, and families. Yet the budget also tells us that the Army has $10.8 billion in unmet needs, the Navy at $9.5 billion short, and the Air Force is $25 billion short. How long will it take to fix these critical backlogs? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Will we ever be able to fix these facilities for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to train for war and for their families to live?
Well, we're increasing the MILCON budget, sir. You know, as we look more broadly at this, as I said earlier, Congressman Wilson, we didn't get into this overnight, and it's going to take time to get us out of this. We were given a top line as the President's budget had to deal with a lot of priorities, and we're doing the best we can with the money that we've been given, which is an increase over what past years have committed to DOD. Is it enough? Can I give you a timeline on this? Probably not right now, but it's going in the right direction, and I think we would all agree with that, even if it's not sufficient in terms of getting us where we need to go. But the Congress has the purse strings, and if the Congress decides to fund the unfunded priority list, some of these issues are listed right there, then that money can be applied to it.
And specifically, Mr. Secretary, the Navy alone submitted unfunded requirements of more than $690 million for critical repairs to airfields, dry docks, wharves, and other facilities. Their Air Force asked for more than $850 million, the Army for $820 million. What is the explanation for the committee, and how should we accept whether the budget request is adequate when the services are asking for so much? And really, there's been a great description by Congresswoman Cheney that we're in a holding pattern. And so we want to work with you. And so how quickly can we get this done?
Well, sir, the budget's growing, so a holding pattern I don't agree with. It's not sufficient to address all the shortfalls that grew over years. I'll be the first to admit that. And if the Congress sees fit to give us enough money to do all that, then we could probably do it a lot faster. But for me to give you an estimate would take a heck of a lot of analysis and a firm, stable budget horizon that we have not enjoyed in a decade.
Thank you very much again for all of you being here tonight.
Mr. Gates, make it good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure when the Secretary said that he kept others up at night, he quite had this in mind. Mr. Secretary, please know that the warfighters in my district in Northwest Florida are as proud of you as I'm certain you are of them. We've spent now 4 hours in this hearing to essentially answer this question. if we gave you more money than the administration requested with a stable budget horizon, could you use it effectively?
Yes, Congressman, we could.
And would that effective use of money above and beyond what the administration has requested make our troops safer in combat?
We would ensure it did.
And would the money that we could provide above and beyond what the administration has requested do a great deal to advance America's interests throughout the world?
I would presume so, yes.
And as we sit here today, is it accurate that the average airplane in our Air Force is about 27 years old?
I would have to confirm that, but it sounds, it's in the ballpark.
At any other time in the Air Force's history, has the average age of an aircraft been higher?
I don't believe so, but again, I'd have to look at the specific data.
And today in the Air Force, would we have to say that more or less than half of our fighter squadrons are fully spectrum ready?
Well, Congressman, I'd prefer not to get too specific in open hearing, but I think you're about right.
And the fact that we have an Air Force where perhaps readiness is less than optimal, with aircraft that are older than at any other time in the Air Force's history, could you take just a moment and reflect on the impact that has on our ability to project power and the safety of those that we send into combat?
Well, Congressman, I think you've heard from the chairman tonight. We have pilots who are not flying enough to stay current in their aircraft or have their confidence in the aircraft. We have readiness problems across the force. And these, for anyone, I think, who's been on this committee for more than a year, probably this is not a surprise. It was a bit of a shock for me coming back to the department. But what you're outlining appears to be a pretty good definition of the problem.
Earlier in response to a question, you indicated that you thought Qatar was moving in the right direction. I appreciated that characterization because it's quite binary. In a world that is always moving, things are always going in the right direction or in the wrong direction. What characterization would you apply to Turkey? Are they going in the right direction or the wrong direction?
Well, in what regards, sir?
In the same regards in which you answered the question as it related to Qatar.
Qatar was in regard to whether or not they were moving away from funding, and much of it was private funding, not governmental, but funding of any kind of violent extremists. And in that regard, they're moving in the right direction. I'm not aware of Turkey funding violent extremists.
Then in the broadest sense, Mr. Secretary, of Turkey's interaction with the world, with our allies, taking into account our utilization of Turkish airspace, military assets, also taking into consideration the challenges that we have in the Aegean with the Greeks and the Turks, is Turkey moving in the right direction or the wrong direction?
Turkey is a NATO ally, as you know. It's got internal political issues that they're dealing with. They provide an air base that has been invaluable in the fight against ISIS. It's a mixed bag in that regard, but I think right now we're doing the best we can to work with Turkey in areas where we have common interests in order to take advantage of the situation that they provide, being right on the border, being a frontline state against terrorists.
Thank you so much, Secretary Mattis. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you both for responding to all the questions that this committee put to you. I think you can tell there's bipartisan interest in going above 603. There is also bipartisan interest in working with you to reform the department to be more agile and more efficient, which is also a part of the equation. So needless to say, we've got lots of work together yet to come. Without objection, members have 3 legislative days in which to submit extraneous material for inclusion into the record, consistent with the committee policy limits. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned.